Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for a great panel today with distinguished great three speakers, Noor, May, and Sana. Our topic today is about human rights in the time of COVID-19 or such a global crisis. And I'm joined today by three amazing women who have been doing an amazing job on the region, whether they are in the region or the United States, continuing their work on different issues related to the region. We're joined today by Sana Mustafa. Sana is the founder and manager of Sana Mustafa Consulting LLC and the founding member of the Network for Refugee Voices. She is a consultant on cultural sensitivity to the 10th Partnership for Refugees and WeWork's World Refugee Day campaign. Sana is a Syrian refugee and community development professional currently living in the United States. Our second speaker today is May Sadani. May is the Managing Director and Legal and Judicial Director with the Tahrir Institute in Washington, D.C. She has previously worked at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, among other organizations. Our third speaker from Beirut is Noor Al-Ashi. Noor is a Lebanese activist and the founding member of Mintashrin, a youth-led political movement in Lebanon. Although this is a virtual meeting, I'll be taking questions from you during and right after our speakers finish. Our speakers will be talking for 5 to 7 minutes for their initial remarks, and then we're gonna get your questions and ask them to answer it. Please, if you would like to tweet about this, use the hashtag MEI events, and also you can email us with any questions you have if you need any technical help from our team. So please, if you have any question, you can submit it at any time, and I'll be taking those questions right after our speakers finish their initial remarks. May, why don't we start with you to tell us more about your work and how it's been affected during the last 2 to 3 months. What are the current challenges you are facing and how you are trying to cope with those challenges?
Sure. Thank you, Ibrahim, for moderating, and to MEI for inviting me. I'll dive right in. So I think there's no doubt that COVID has had and will have pivotal impact on human rights globally, and certainly in the MENA region as well. While we keep reading headlines about COVID being a golden moment to entrench authoritarianism, I'd also like to argue that it's actually a golden moment for the human rights community as well. But before I put my rose-colored glasses on, I will start by saying that we are certainly seeing a spike in human rights violations and in COVID being used as pretext for excessive rights restriction region. We're seeing states of emergency that are being declared and that are affecting more than just public health in places like Palestine and Egypt. We're seeing curfews that are being put into place that are at times enforced with violence, like Morocco, or with excessive jail terms, like Jordan. And while a number of countries have responded to the health crisis in their detention facilities by ordering some releases, the vast majority of these releases continue to leave out political prisoners. Additionally, inside prisons, the poor conditions continue, it remains impossible to social distance, and there's very little transparency on what measures are in place to protect the prison population. All of this is happening as new arrests are occurring in places like Algeria and Egypt. And while countries in the region, most of them have commendably moved towards hosting remote and virtual court trials to protect due process, Egypt is going in the opposite direction. It's renewing pretrial detentions on paper in the hundreds and in the absence of legal counsel or even bringing the defendants to court. And we're also seeing COVID being used as pretext to further government surveillance and accordingly affect privacy as well. In Israel, for example, we're seeing cell phone data that was initially collected secretly for counterterrorism purposes being repurposed to retrace the movements of folks with COVID. And finally, I'll say when it comes to freedom of expression and information, authorities are also exercising a very heavy hand in attempting to control the narrative. In Iraq, for example, press credentials for journalists contradicting government reports have been revoked. So prior to this point and up to this point, really, many countries in the region had been largely able to get away with some of these political human rights violations for a few reasons. The violations had tended to target a very small subset of society, and so we didn't have a critical mass being aggravated. and also because these authorities were claiming that they were focusing on what they think are more pressing economic, social, and cultural rights. And so what's different at this moment is that obviously COVID is a health crisis. So there are the holes in the government's claims that they have been prioritizing these economic, social, and cultural rights are more obvious than ever. On a massive scale, we're also seeing political and economic rights intersect for the first time. And I would say, for example, governments that are unable to provide information on COVID testing, that's not just a health issue, it's also a freedom of information issue. And with the caveat, of course, that vulnerable people in the region continue to be disproportionately affected by COVID, COVID is certainly also affecting a much more massive scale of the population. And so it's becoming more clear to observers that violations that are taking place are not one-off, but rather systematic. And so people are actually asking questions about the systems in place, not one-off violations. So what does this all mean? I think in the immediate, we'll certainly continue to see authoritarian behavior and rights restrictions. The question for me, though, is about the medium and long term. And I do believe that the human rights movement, the protest movements, and civil society have an unprecedented opportunity here. Traditionally, many of these movements were dismissed by some naysayers because they're perceived as fighting for a luxury or the rights of some minority that doesn't affect the masses, if you will. But in this moment, I would argue that the audience for the rights movement is larger than ever. I don't believe we will ever have another moment in history where everyone is sitting at home and for the most part, they're monitoring and assessing every move the government makes and internalizing what this means, what's working and what isn't. And so these human rights movements really have a unique platform to be able to shape the public discourse, to ask tough questions, not just about particular violations, but about the systems that allow them to take place, to offer solutions, and for lack of a better phrase, I would say to sell their theory of change to the everyday public. That is that systems of governance that are more democratic in representing the people and their needs, that are more transparent in how they're trying to meet these needs, and that can actually be held accountable when they're unable to meet these needs, those are the types of societies that will keep citizens safe. And I think you're starting to see this on the ground with the work of advocates across the region. In Egypt, for example, we have lawyers who are taking the time to explain why a prison outbreak is not just about the health of detainees, but the health of society as a whole, and then using that to argue why trial detention is an exceptional measure and pretrial detainees should be released. In countries like Lebanon and Algeria, where there were protest movements prior to COVID taking place, these protests are again picking up in different formats creatively and tying their original demands into the vulnerabilities exposed by COVID, and again underscoring that this has always been the same core issues. Ultimately, I would say this is a unique moment of norms creation. And if the rights movement doesn't take the lead and doesn't capitalize on this by creating and furthering new norms, we know, unfortunately, that governments in the region certainly will. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to engaging with my fellow panelists and hearing from the audience with their questions.
Thank you very much, May, for this broad image about what's going on in the region, from Morocco to Egypt to Israel to the Gulf and also the Levant. Noor, I would like to hear more, if you could share with us about your experience in Lebanon. Lebanon is going through some very sensitive time and critical moments. We have a lot of political and economic pressure. How is that affecting also your work during the time of COVID-19? Did that affect the work of Mintashrin? Also, if you could share with us more about your work and what Mintashrin does in Lebanon, that would be really helpful.
So as an activist in a newly founded movement, Mintashrin, which is a youth-led progressive movement seeking to build a democratic, civil, and modern country based on the rule of law, social justice, and of course, basic human rights, it was very hard for us at first to accept this reality when we had this ability to constantly mobilize in different areas in Lebanon. But of course, when the pandemic started hitting hard, we saw how serious it is and realized that the mobilization part of our revolution will be put on hold temporarily. Of course, one of our most important values is the safety and the health of the Lebanese citizens. But also, we knew that in a way, the government and the security apparatus, which are controlled by the current corrupt political ruling class, will try to take advantage of this situation, especially when it comes to oppressing the activists, when it comes to their freedom of expression. And they will also take advantage because there are restrictions when it comes to mobilization. And we had several attacks and incidents when it comes to the abuses against the freedom of expression used against the activists. During the first week of quarantine, we saw the internal security forces, which is controlled by the political class, waging a very violent crackdown against the activist camps in Beirut. And these camps, to be honest, they have a very symbolic meaning to the activists and all revolution groups, because this is where it all started on October 17th, where we took to the streets and fought for our freedom and basic human rights. And this crackdown was not just a request to leave the tents. It was more of an armed ambush where the ISF started beating activists and burned their tents with their belongings inside. And they also detained activists who tried to resist. And then we saw this happening in other areas in Lebanon, in the Bekaa, for example, and in Tripoli. We also saw a new trend where the government tries to shut down each and every website that does not go and is not aligned with the government's narrative. And we saw this happening to the websites related to the exchange, currency exchange rate, especially, where the government accused these websites of the accelerating the currency devaluation. And we all know that's a desperate measure because the economic situation was already collapsing way before the revolution. And during the pandemic was a catalyst in accelerating and leading to this economic collapse. And also, the devaluation of the lira happened due to the economic variables and the rules of supply and demand. And then we also saw a trend that is happening, which is summoning very vocal activists when it comes to expressing themselves and being vocal on social media platforms and summoning them for investigations. And at first, when we had this ability and the leverage to constantly mobilize, the ISF were trying, and security apparatus were trying to avoid that because they knew that we would actually come down and support these victims. It actually happened to one of Mentishrin's members, a person and an activist who is very vocal, he's very straightforward, he's very transparent, and has a lot of reach with a lot of followers. And the government attacked him so many times, but this time they contacted him while in quarantine, and that at that time it was the climax of the pandemics in Lebanon, and requested him to show up for an investigation. Of course, at first, he refused because he's putting himself and his family at risk. And then we also knew that the ISF showed up to his place in Beirut, where his roommate is, to ask about the whereabouts of this activist. And then, of course, the lawyer of this activist called the Cyber Crime Bureau to explain to the officer how bad and how risky it is to let him show up to the hearing. But the activist decided to show up at the end, but he made it super confidential because he knew if he made this viral, his supporters and the activists would would actually go down and take it to the streets, and he didn't want to put anyone at risk. But what the sad part about it is that when he actually showed up, the reason why he was called for this investigation was due for a video that he did not post. He reposted, and he did not do it himself. And this video exposed a government official mentioning that this government official actually bought a social media account with high number of followers. So we can see how trivial these the reason why he was called for this investigation. And then they made him actually post an apology, and we all knew that it wasn't his words, and it was the only reason, the only way to let him out. So and then we also had other incident related to digital contact. We had an activist was always in the front lines that posted a video attacking prominent religious figures. And in that video, he was requesting the clergy to shift its resources to help the poor, because we know that the government at the end of the day want people confined at home without helping the most vulnerable communities. And in case they help them, they only try to help their supporters. Also, we've seen how detainees have been tortured with very violent ways, in shaving heads, and even electrocutions were happening while wet. We also have seen how the Lebanese army conducted and resorted live ammunition towards against angry crowds in Tripoli. And Tripoli is the poorest area in Lebanon, in the Mediterranean Sea, which led to the death of a very young activist called Fawaz As-Saman, and other activists were detained, of course. And as Mintashin and other revolution groups, we conducted a lot of online campaign called La Lil Qama, No to Oppression. And we actually reposted all of the videos that the activists were detained or investigated about. And we did that with the help of all of revolution groups inside and outside of Lebanon. And we've also seen a high rate of domestic violence against women, and I think that's been happening not only in Lebanon but in the Arab countries, and I can say globally as well. These violent acts have been happening for the most insignificant reasons by partners, husbands, and even brothers. And as Mintashin, of course, and other groups, we had several campaigns online. We had residents all over Lebanon hanging banners on their balcony, promoting the against violence domestic violence hotline. And we as Mintashin also printed out more than 50,000 stickers to promote the domestic violence hotline, and encouraging women to reach out and ask for help. And according to local NGOs, the calls of domestic violence have doubled and even tripled ever since the pandemic, and comparing to last year's numbers as well. Now, of course, as Mintashin, we acted, and we thought it's really very responsible to stop our mobilization part when it comes to our revolution. We decided to shift our resources towards social work because we knew something had to be done. We started our own food box initiative, and until today we distributed more than 1,000 boxes across Lebanon. And we went from actually buying these boxes to now actually doing them ourselves. We're trying to help as much as possible without any discrimination all over Lebanon. And then we realized that it's really important to help first medical responders who are exposed to the virus on a daily basis and cannot go back to their home. So we launched Baytna Baytak, which means in Arabic, your home is my home. And through our network and an online campaign, we tried to provide more than 300 apartments and hotel rooms so that doctors, Red Cross, members could actually go to within this pandemic. And now that you know that the economic situation is very disastrous and the people are taking back to the streets, because in some areas you have people who would rather die from the coronavirus than out of hunger. So we decided to launch a mask production line where with each mask someone buys, we give out another mask. And now it's time to, ever since the quarantine happened, we took that time to organize ourselves more, to strategize, to connect with the revolution groups inside and outside of Lebanon. We reached out to the Lebanese diaspora, and we've been all working together and on all initiatives and trying to reach out as much as possible, because at the end of the day, the only way to fight the current corrupt leaders and class is when we are unified and when we consolidate all of our efforts together. So I'm going to stop now.
Great, thank you very much, Noor. That's very, very fascinating. A reminder for our audience, we started to get some questions, but a reminder again how you can submit a question. You have three different ways. You can either submit your question through Zoom in, through the Q&A feature, or if you are calling in by phone, you can submit your question either via Twitter using hashtag MEI events, or by sending an email to events@mei.edu. Sana, that brings us to your work. Noor just touched on some of the work with refugees and with women in Lebanon, and we know that the refugee population in the region is huge, and it's been already going through a lot of difficulties. You've been doing a lot of work on refugees and women issues through your own organization, through the network, and through the women political movement. We would like to hear more about your work, especially that's related to the refugees and women.
Thank you, Brahim, and thanks for having me and putting this together. I think May and Noor really gave a detailed overview, an amazing one, on the situation and of civil society in the MENA region. And what I will be talking about is actually a specific group within people live in the region, which is the refugee communities who can't organize to be a civil society even. And so for the next 10 minutes or less, I will be talking about the situation of their rights at the moment. And then briefly, I'll touch upon the situation in Syria. And so maybe I will start with first giving an overview of refugee rights, human rights in the region before COVID and Corona. And as some of you know, the region hosts, between actually Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, we host over 5.6 million refugees, and the majority comes from Syria. And within this 5.6 million, the majority of those refugees actually are not in camps, they are in urban settings. The situation of refugees in the MENA region has always been one of the worst for refugees, as none of the countries that hosting those refugees have signed to the 1951 convention. Those countries they are all authoritarianships. They already struggling with their own economic situation, economic crises, political crises. And so basically hosting refugees was not the best for refugees themselves. And as we all witnessed in 2015, 16, and 17, we started seeing a huge movement, from refugees from these three countries, Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, towards Europe, and taking boats and risking their lives. And that's not because of lack of food and shelter in those countries. It's because of the lack of rights the lack of safety, the lack of security, which, you know, for over now, since the Palestinian refugees, if you want, in the region, and so for over 5 decades for now, refugees continue to be refugees in the region, and they continue, I mean, even Palestinians as of now, we hosted them in Syria and in Lebanon, like they don't have identification, they don't have rights, they have nothing. And so there has been a system in the region to actually give refugees no rights, period, and keep them, you know, dependent on food and shelter. So I feel like, you know, I would assume a lot of us could understand the situation of refugees before COVID. With COVID-19, I mean, everything that was happening now, it's double and triple, and even the level of abuse of human rights and the violation is actually beyond. And the worst situation and the worst right now is that it's actually very normalized. We even now when we talk about refugees, the majority talks about providing food. And that's of course very important, but really talking about rights when it comes to refugees, it's not a conversation. And so I would like now to talk actually about the situation in for refugees during COVID. And so, for example, definitely refugee communities, they don't have the luxury of any preventive measures such as social distancing, masks, and gloves. And so, for the obvious reasons of them not living in normal houses or in situations where they could afford this privilege. Of course, starvation, refugees before, I mean, in the region, refugees are not allowed to work, period. Jordan had issued around 200,000 work permits for over 700,000 refugees that Jordan hosting, and those 200,000 work permits are very narrow to specific fields. In Turkey, refugees formally cannot work. In Lebanon, it's even worse. And so even before the COVID-19, refugees couldn't work formally, so they've always worked in the informal sector, which exposed them to exploitation and violation of their rights without having access to justice when that happened. Now, with COVID, with the curfews, refugees are actually not allowed to leave their houses and their tents. And so they're not allowed to work. So of course, this situation, they're not basically able to feed their families. And as I mentioned before, because of the extra, before COVID, you know, we all know, for example, in Lebanon, there has always been curfew on the movement of Syrians and when they can move and where they can move and after what time and before what time. And now it continues to be the same. The difference is that now it's not only in Lebanon, it's in Turkey and in Jordan as well. The thing I want to talk about maybe that's more relevant to COVID-19 is about refugees in the region access to healthcare and testing. So in theory, a number of major hosting countries such as Turkey and Jordan have announced that everyone should have access to COVID-19 testing, including refugees, despite their legal rights. Lebanon is even worse at that. It has not even given refugees access to healthcare or testing or protection, not even in theory. But even those countries that given access in theory, there are multiple reasons that I'm going to discuss why refugees are scared of coming forward, actually, even if they think they might be COVID positive or they're sick. There are reasons that refugees, despite in theory being given access to healthcare, they're not. And the reasons are, we could start with, refugees have experienced xenophobia and traumatizing experiences for decades, whether when dealing with national systems in their hosting countries, and whether when they're trying to access public services or simply existing in these new communities. And so there's no trust. Like an average person would think like, okay, they might treat us now, I might go and they might treat me now. How would I know that if I come back, they won't come back later to me when this COVID craziness is over and use this against me? And so there's no trust, and there's trauma, and there's decades of xenophobia. The other reason refugees would not come forward, even if they were given access to healthcare, it's because of the fear of detention. And you know, I would give an example. In Jordan, one of our partners, they do legal representation for refugees, and they were talking about, you know, how refugees had, for example, to break the curfew and the lockdown laws because they have to feed their families, and so as a result, they have been detained, and without no legal representation and without no right to, you know, defend their case or anything. Now they are detained. And so the number actually of refugees who've been detained now, just in light of COVID, has increased a lot. And so definitely refugees fear detention if they come forward for testing. The other thing that they fear, discrimination. As I mentioned before COVID, the level of discrimination and xenophobia is at its top, and now they fear that going even to the healthcare facility and coming forward would expose them to more discrimination. I mean, as we know, there's an study, there's a story that came out really viral that happened in Lebanon when a refugee doesn't even have COVID. They went, to grab medicine from the pharmacy, has nothing to do with COVID, and they were traced back to their tent by the informal thugs in Lebanon, and they were beaten up and kicked out. And so they can't even come forward to treat the existing issues that they may be dealing with it. And of course, lastly but not least, the fear of deportation. As I said again, how would we know if we come forward and we get tested that they won't use this against us? Now they know where we are and everything. They would come and try to deport us after that. And so all of this, if we think about why refugees have that much fear, why there's that much systematic abuse of their rights, I mean, I could think of like one of the major reasons that's refugees experience this level of violation of human rights. It's the lack of documentation and legal status. It's the lack of rights. Refugees in MENA have barely any rights, and so having to provide. I think one of the main issues that I have been facing in the refugee response sector is that the sector is super focused on providing humanitarian development aid. And once we talk about refugee rights, it's always sounds like a luxury. And it's yeah, we need to provide people with food and shelter, and then we'll discuss rights. They're actually connected. And one of the major reasons, as I mentioned, for refugees to flee to Europe was that, again, not lack of food and shelter. It was lack of safety, lack of documentation, lack of legal status. And so what could we learn from that? I think what we could learn is that including refugees in government responses plans in the MENA region, in COVID response plans, and providing them with safe and equal access to healthcare system does protect everyone. And as May and Noor has mentioned, it's really not about this specific group, it's really for the health of the community. So it's a win-win when we include refugees in our response plans and provide safe and equal access. We could also learn that we should use this moment to push for regulating refugees and the importance of giving them rights. COVID has provided an example of how the lack of rights in normal times results in major consequences in difficult times, and then which puts all community members at risk. And again, maybe I would like to reiterate one more point, is that the refugee response sector has to start working and talking about refugee rights. This conversation has to become more normalized. And that's why when you are a refugee, you're forever a refugee. You never transition to something else, at least in the MENA region. And so the current approach does not pave the way for long-term dignifying solution for refugees. It does not treat refugees as human who should have rights. The conversation about refugees and human rights is almost impossible in this field. And when they do happen, actually, they happen in the context of right for food, right for shelter, not right for documentation, not the right for freedom of movement, not right for legal status, and not the right to work or rights at work. So unless we incorporate the human and legal rights lens into the solution, I'm afraid that refugees will forever be refugees and dependent on host countries and international aid. The last thing I would like to mention is about situation in Syria and human rights. I mean, briefly, for the past 9 years, we know the situation, the human rights situation in Syria, and the situation and the violation and the crackdown and the detention. One of the things that I would like to raise here is that one of the issues that the regime is really we could use this moment to talk about is the detainees file in Syria. There's over 100,000 forcibly disappeared persons between men, women, children, elderlies, that their fate has been unknown for the past 9 years in Syria. And including as a family, as a member, as a daughter of one of those persons who've been forcibly disappeared, we are very much worried for their health, for their faith. And we would want to use this moment to ask, I mean, I'm not sure we can ask, but to really try to bring the conversation back about the detainees file, and that the corona does impose an extra threat for us, for their health, and so we definitely demand the release of detainees. I'll stop here and I look forward for questions.
Thank you so much, Sana, for your insights about your work with the refugees and the current situation and difficulties that different civil society groups are facing in the region. I have so many questions for the three of you, but also I started getting questions. So I'll give the priority for the questions we got. And then if I have more time, I will definitely ask my questions as well. So the first question is from Marianne, and she's asking, I read the question for you, and then she didn't direct the question for anyone, so feel free to answer that. The question is, to support marginalized communities like LGBTQ individuals, what kind of democracy and rights programs would be most valuable for international organizations to fund and implement? And I think this is a very important question about funding and how might that get affected during this time. We see that the economy is doing bad, there is different economic problems. How would that, how do you expect that to affect your funding in the future? The rest of the question says to respond to emerging human rights violations. That's to say, what kind of activities would be beneficial? What are priorities or what are the priority areas for change among LGBT populations? So a question about the LGBT communities in the region and what could be done. What are the priorities for the international organizations from your perspective? Please feel free, Noor, May, or Sana, to jump in and answer that question from your angle. Noor, would you like?
Sorry.
Oh, no,
I can jump in, Ibrahim, briefly if you want. I will say that first off, the most important thing is to, depending on what marginalized group or minority you're talking about, to actually center their voices in the decision-making process. LGBT organizations know what they need best, and they're doing excellent work. So I think the first and most important thing is, whether you're talking about refugees, whether you're talking about LGBT organizations, whether you're talking about women, to be talking to civil society organizations in those spaces, because they are the ones who understand their needs the best. With that caveat, of course, I would also say that there's two levels of response that I can think of. One, from a COVID perspective, it's important to recognize that marginalized populations, whether you're talking about LGBT individuals, whether you're talking about detainees, refugees, they all face specific and compounded challenges because of COVID. Zooming in on LGBT individuals, for example, they're much more likely in poverty, to lack access to inadequate medical care, to not have basic necessities because of discrimination in society and because of these systematic issues. So there's a need for response on that level. But at the same time, the right to their identity is in question as well all the time, and the basic political and social that come along with being a member of a minority community don't go away just because the whole world is focused on COVID. So I think any response will have to balance those two things and recognize that not all the resources can go to just the COVID lens, that these minority populations continue to fight for their life, fight for their identity in the contexts in which they exist.
Thanks, May. Noor or Sana, would you like to add anything to this question?
No, I would just like to reiterate what May said about it's not the what that's missing, and the what could be known from asking and working with LGBT groups, communities, but it's really about the who. So, I mean, for international organizations, I would definitely encourage and push for localized support, localized funding that's really directed to LGBTQ-led organizations, and they know best, as May said, what they need.
And that could be applicable, as I understood from you, over all the types of civil society groups.
Yeah, let's cut the man in the middle, you know, let's directly support and fund local solution by local people.
Exactly. Okay, I move to the second question. Jassim has two questions. I'll try to put them both together, and they are both about the Gulf states and the conditions of workers there. So the question is, wonder if you have thoughts about the plight of immigrant workers in the Gulf. Sadly, we've been hearing hate messages about them on the ground of uncovery of corona cases amongst them. How worried should we be? The second question about same Gulf countries increase their activities and infrastructure following corona. Some of these measures could stay on. So the questions about the situation of the workers and that some hate speech been around on social media against the foreign workers. Is that, like, does that worry you? And also for the measures that have been applied to restrict different activities to fight COVID-19. Are you also worried that those activities or measures will stay in place even after the pandemic is over? May, I would like to start with you, since you're a lawyer and your work also covers a wide area in the region.
I think I don't have too much to add on this question. I would say that similar to what we were talking about when it comes to minority groups and marginalized groups, migrant workers have been a marginalized group in the region for a long time. And what we're seeing, and I know everyone knows the reporting already, is that they're being disproportionately affected by restrictions on freedom of movement, that at times they're unable to return to their homes, and that of course all the institutional challenges that remain with lack of documentation, freedom of movement, identity questions remain. And so what we're really seeing, in my opinion, when it comes to not just migrant workers, but all of these communities, are long, deep-seated issues that have existed this whole time, but they're just bubbling up to the surface because all of this is happening at the same time. And so you're seeing the institutional issues that affect detainees, you're seeing the institutional issues that affect refugees, you're seeing the institutional issues that affect migrant workers, and it's all out of the bag now. So it becomes that much more difficult, I would say, to just address things with superficial solutions. I think this is the moment really for us to be critically thinking about how we can solve some of these deeper issues. For example, with migrant workers, how we can better guarantee that they have freedom of movement, that their right to documentation isn't implicated and affected, that they're able to work in safe conditions.
Thank you, and probably also that's also brings us to the situation in Lebanon and the refugees and the Syrian workers as well. Noor, have you done any work related to that, to also the hate speech that foreign workers in Lebanon face, whether they are like Syrian refugees or from other communities? Did you see any difference or changes in the last few months on that issue?
So the thing I just like to add that say that this has been happening for a long time, but now people are seeing it more because everyone is working remotely and constantly working on the social platform. But this has been happening for a long time when it comes to domestic workers or refugees. And we have a lot of organizations, including ourselves, trying to help as much as possible when it comes to the hate speech, because at the end of the day, they have rights, and we need to respect that as much as possible. But I know it's sometimes I think I'm good.
Thank you. My third question, and I will direct it to, or the fourth question, and I'll direct it to you, Sana. The question is from Arij, and she is a former UN staff that worked in Jordan and Iraq. The question says, I believe it's the time to cooperate with local government to come up with future plans to mitigate the current condition. So are you guys setting up any future plans to help refugees and other sectors of communities in need? Time is crucial and resources are limited, as we all know. So I know also, Sana, through your work with the Refugee Network, that you try to coordinate the response through, like, across the private sector and the public sector and different governments in the region and beyond. How did that change at all in the last few months? And how do you envision the coming few months to be? Did your priorities change in your advocacy activities?
Yeah, thanks, Arish, for the question. And I do definitely agree that multi-sectorial design solutions are the best solutions. And when everyone in the community that's affected by a certain crisis is part of the solutions are more informed, well-informed, and efficient. And the reason we have refugees, the average stay in a camp is 27 years, is that because solutions have always been designed by a single actor, and they're exclusive of refugees themselves or exclusive of the host community. And so there is, I mean, for me, it's like sometimes it's too obvious that where the problem is. And as I said, unfortunately, things have been systematic. And so to change that, it's been a process. I mean, through my work with the Global Refugee-led Network, or even in my current capacity, which I wanted to correct you, Brahim, but that's completely fine. I'm working as the Associate Director of Partnerships at Asylum Access.
Mm-hmm.
But through my work with the Global Refugee-led Network as consultant, and now we don't pursue any single project or solution without including the different stakeholders that we think are at the center of the solution. And I do think that this is a lens that has been missing, and I definitely push for it. I would say, like, in our work with the Global Refugee-led Network, for example, it's definitely, we work globally and in different regions, but the MENA region is one of the hardest regions that we've been trying to work on, because we're basically asking and demanding decision makers to consider to talk with refugees. And when refugees in the region have no legal status, have no rights, and marginalized more than refugees in Europe, for example. And so there are layers that we're trying to break into by normalizing the conversation around putting refugees and host community at the heart and center of policymaking. And so, but it's been 4 years of work, and it takes a lot of advocacy, but it is really about repeating your message. It's about repeating yourself and repeating your message and never giving up. With Asylum Access, we actually worked in Jordan and Lebanon. Well, our biggest operations are in Mexico, Thailand, and Malaysia, where we do advocacy. And so our major work is about actually working with local governments and working with municipalities. And I do agree with you that actually it's easier to work with local government than national governments, and it's at their interest. And they tend to be more flexible, and we should leverage major actors such as the private sector. The private sector has so much power because of the money and because of the status in basically pushing governments to have certain conversations. If it wasn't for the Jordan Compact, where the private sector was involved, even the 200,000 work permits would have not been issued. And so we can see that they have a role. The issue with their role is that it's also like it's so apolitical, and any work about rights and legal status, people think of it as political work, and it's actually not. It's advocacy, and advocacy is not always political in the sense like you're opposing governments. You're identifying certain set of regulations and laws, and you're trying to advocate and engage with the government to explain why this is important for everyone. So I do encourage all of us to be political, if that's what political means, and try to advocate for refugees having rights, and try to design more multi-sectorial solutions.
Thank you, Sana. May or Noor, would you like to add anything for this question about coordinating with local governments? Or also we widen the question and we ask also about coordinating with other civil society organizations across the region. So do you envision that COVID-19 will make the work of civil society organizations more local? Or do you think it will also bring some opportunities for those organizations to coordinate together and learn from each other?
I I think that it's a little bit of both, Ibrahim. You have the local solutions that we're seeing unfolding. I'll give you an example. In places like Morocco and Tunisia, civil society organizations are working directly with prison authority staff to say, hey, we want to keep your prison staff safe. We also want to keep detainees safe. Here are the best practices. Here's what to do. The situation is different in each country, and that may not be possible, but I think there is at times, and depending on context, space, obviously, to engage with local authorities. When we're talking about civil society more broadly, I will say there's a ton of work to be done in country, but there are so many lessons learned and best practices to share regionally as well. And I know that's something that I've been seeing in my own work. For example, I'll give you the situation of detainees. The fact is, when we entered COVID, we had very little understanding as an international legal community what it meant to protect the rights of prisoners during an emergency as big as COVID. And so you began to see organizations in the detention space engage together to identify what the issues were and begin to engage with the UN, with special rapporteurs, other procedures to be telling them to drive the conversation with things like the WHO to say this is what protecting human rights means in a time of crisis. Human rights are not something that are exceptional or that we only should care about when we don't have a pandemic. It's actually the opposite. They're more important than ever. And so you began to see this norms creation based on the shared experience of organizations. And I know certainly in the detention space, you have organizations in Palestine, working with organizations from Egypt, working with Lebanon, working with Syria. Yes, every context has the facts that make it a little bit different, but at the end of the day, the rights and the legal norms are the same. So I think you absolutely will see a lot more regional coordination. And I would say that if I'm in the donor's shoes, I would be funding that work as well, because it does have its value in addition to the specific country work as well.
Thanks, May. The next question I directed to you, Noor, is from Gareth, and the question is COVID-19 increasing a popular sense that governments should act to reduce inequalities? Do you think that the current pandemic will change what people in the region expect from the governments? Do you see that might happen, or like especially from your experience in Lebanon? Noor, yeah.
Can you just repeat the question, please? Because my connection was.
Of course. So the question is, if COVID-19 is increasing a popular sense that governments should act to reduce inequalities. It's about what people expect from their governments in the region. Do you envision any changes in what people expect? What the priorities could be? For example, do you think people would be focusing more on the health sector and expect the government to be doing a better work, maybe preventive work in the future to avoid such pandemics?
Okay, so first I want to start by saying that the current government in Lebanon is basically represents the political parties that we have for 13 years now. And what's been happening in Lebanon is that they've seen, for example, the Ministry of Health working and they've seen it as if it's something major happening when it comes to taking the right safety measures. But at the same time, the Lebanese need to understand that what this minister is doing is something very basic, and taking into this safety measure is any minister would actually be doing. But because we have been in Lebanon, we have this image of minister not doing anything, basically, that they've seen a major change in what's going on now and how they are interacting when it comes to COVID-19 and the pandemic. But at the same time, we've been seeing contradiction between, for example, the Ministry of Interior Ministry and the Health. For example, we have restaurants and bars opening now, but at the same time, the Ministry of Health wants 48 hours or maybe more, 72 hours of total lockdown. So here you see the contradiction, and people are kind of lost. And at the same time, when they started opening construction sites and restaurants, and when the flights came from Lebanon to rescue the Lebanese citizens and bring them back to Lebanon, we didn't didn't see any safety measures. What they did is that they tested these passengers, and in case, and we know that COVID-19 will not, even if the test is negative, it could appear within 10 or 15 days, for example, and we didn't see any follow-up happening to these people, and a lot of people were questioning that. And we also, for the last 4 days, we've seen an increase in the numbers. So I hope that they will take into consideration extra measures, but until now, I don't think it's been enough, to be honest.
Thank you, Noor. We have 2 more questions and 5 minutes. We have a question from Rose about what could Americans do to help, but I will leave that question until the end. We'll finish with that question. We have a question from Yulia. The question says, thank you ladies for talking about your experiences. I would like to know, what do you think about the UN role with refugees? Do you think they are effective, or should they do more in the field when it's about fighting for human rights? Sana, would you like to take that question, since you've done some work close to the UN?
Yeah, well, let's try to answer that without being too cynical. I mean, of course, like, listen, the UN, and I think we're speaking here about UNHCR. UNHCR, you know, has a major role in this, and in serving refugee communities. But we also should understand that the mere existence of UNHCR is because refugees exist. And so I think that, like, poses some questions about how much the solution could be systematic and sustainable and really long-term. The other thing is that we tend to think that of the UN as a civil society group or an NGO. UN is a multi-governmental organization. So UNHCR represents governments, actually. They get their funds from governments. And so, you know, working in anything that's not what the governments want, it's not what UNHCR is going to do. And so what I'm trying to say is that probably if a UNHCR person would be with us, they would say, like, they are in a difficult position where, you know, probably most of the staff have that issue at the bottom of their heart. And I always give people the benefit of the doubt, and they have the best intentions, but they because of their position, because of their funding, and because of so many things, they have limited role. That being said, I'm not justifying. I'm just like, maybe if they were here, they would say that. But I think they could definitely do more. They are very, very distant from any work that has to do with rights or like legal status or something that has to do with human rights for refugees. Can they do more on this? Yes. Can they play more like soft diplomacy and try to integrate some of this to their work little by little? Of course, I think they can. I think one of the other issues that UNHCR faces is that they're very traditional in their work methods and the people they work with. And I think that's one of the major issues. Their solutions are not localized. They don't work directly with local communities, and they don't fund local communities immediately. They fund them through an NGO. And so I think they could do better 100% with acknowledgement of the important work they do as well.
Thanks, Sana. Very interesting. In the last 2 minutes, I'll ask each of you if you have any closing remarks, and also if you could address the last question from Rose, which says, thank you for sharing these disturbing facts on the ground in the MENA region. Can you please suggest some ways that Americans can advocate effectively for these various human rights issues? So that question and any final remarks will go in the same sequence that we started. We'll go with you, May, and then Noor, and then Sana. Please, May.
Sure. Starting with the question first on the US, I think that the US would do well to recognize that its alliances carry weight in the region, and it certainly has a number of allies in the region that it is funding, that it is providing technical support to, that it is engaging with on a regular basis. And while COVID may seem to have slowed that or taken a little bit of the attention away from these, the reality is these countries continue to work together and engage. And so the US will continue to be a leader in this space. And it's of the utmost importance, I would say, that it would recognize that the stability that it has been looking for in the region is actually deeply tied to the protection of rights, both during COVID and well after it as well. And that at the essence, these rights issues are governance issues. It's a much larger question than an individual person's violations. Rather, it's a system that is meant to protect society and by extension meet the needs of its people. And I think the US will continue to have a role in that, both in this immediate moment and long term as well. And I'll close by iterating again that I do believe that this is a rare moment for societies. It's very rare that all of a country's governance issues are on the table, that all of these everyday people are at home paying attention, waiting and watching what the government is going to do. And so I can't underscore enough the fact that we have such a unique role to play as civil society organizations, as advocates, as human rights activists, as lawyers, as journalists, in both documenting what's happening in this moment, but also digging deep and identifying that the vulnerabilities that we're seeing today are just bubbling up now, but they're tied to much deeper issues that we need to begin to address. And I think no better moment than this moment.
Thank you, May. Noor, please, in 30 seconds or so, also your closing remarks.
Okay, so I'm just gonna briefly say that in the US, like they always promoted and brought more awareness when it comes to human rights and the importance of equality and everything related against discrimination. So I think that's where they will continue to play that role globally. And lastly, I want to add that all the movements that have been happening in the world are basically to fight against our basic human rights, especially in the Arab countries, because we reached a point where we can no longer take all the discrimination and the sectarian mentalities, and finally these countries are achieving a point where they can finally see the system as a whole rather than sect-based political parties, and that's very important. That maybe it happened. We were maybe okay. We were maybe happened. It took us a while to do it, but at least we are on the right track now, and we are fighting for our freedom.
Thanks, Noor. The last word is for you, Sana.
Yeah, thank you, Brahim. I would say for Americans, please exercise your citizenship. Please vote for officials, representatives, and administrations that respect human rights, because US policies affect global policies, including the Middle East. And the second thing I would say, please, I would encourage Americans in all different capacities that work on the region or not to try to put more efforts in building partnerships with people in the region directly, and trying to create these close connections, because I think there is maybe stereotypes or misinformation, and that's due to lack of communication, and so definitely more local partnerships. And yeah, thank you, Brahim and MAE, for having us.
Of course, thank you very much. That was really interesting and very helpful. Thank you for helping us understand what's going on in the region and how COVID-19 is affecting the work of civil societies in the region, with the challenges they are facing and how they are coping with those challenges. Thank you not only for being here today with us, but thank you for the great work you are doing, the three of you. It was an honor to host you. And to our audience, thank you very much for attending this panel. Please check the website to see what other events we have this week and the coming week, as we are actually increasing the number of panels we are running these days. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.